Okay, so look, we'll start off this afternoon with the video presentation. It's about 6 or 7 minutes long, and this really gives a bit of an outline of where we're up to so far in the study, and specifically on the workshop 2 data. Now, if you remember, the workshop 2 data was created in the second series of workshops that asked you to do a lot of ranking of the gaps. So if you remember, we presented participants with 20 of the gaps that had come up in the first phase of research, and then we asked people to rate them accordingly as to whether or not they saw them as high priorities or as low priorities in the research agenda. And then we asked people to sort of comment, particularly on those ones that were the high ones. So what we're doing today is to present that data back to you. So here we go.
Hello, welcome again to the Innovative Learning Environment and Student Experience Scoping Study. This video is an update on our progress to date with a specific focus on Workshop 2 findings. The ILESE Scoping Study has 3 driving questions. Where has existing research led us? What is the critical research that must be done? And how should such research be designed? In Workshop 1, we focus primarily on the first question, gathering the citations of research we currently use. We also use the discussions between team members to feed back some initial ideas about what educators, academics, and industry feel are the research gaps in their sector. In Workshop 2, we aim to gather more concrete evidence on question 2, what gaps in research must be addressed? Having used the Workshop 1 discussions to identify 20 research gaps that exist, the aim of Workshop 2 was to begin ranking these gaps to determine priority areas for future research. It is this ranking of gaps that will be the focus of today's video. This is the overall ranking based on the full data set. Evaluation of learning environments, the design of ILESE, and their impact on student engagement remain a priority for participants, as identified across both workshops. Affective learning outcomes, sometimes referred to as 21st century learning skills, and health and wellbeing rounded out the top 5. It is important to note that we created a scaled frequency for this analysis so that each sector, academia, education, and industry, had equal say in determining the priorities on this list. In this analysis, it was evident that there are some different priorities for each sector. Often 2 sectors ranked a gap more highly than the third. We also explored how much the frequencies ranged, shown on the right-hand side of the list. This showed greater consensus on gaps such as affective learning outcomes and health and wellbeing, and greater differences between how the sectors rank issues such as student engagement. Consequently, we explored the top 5 priorities for each sector separately to see where differences lie. Academics had equal frequencies for 3rd and 5th place on their list. While many of their top 5 are the same as the overall list, they also prioritised inclusiveness and teaching. They were the only sector to include teaching in their top 5, and the only sector to not include student engagement. Education had the most representation of all the sectors in the second workshop, and a much wider distribution of frequencies across individuals' top 5 than the other sectors. Education showed some differences in their priority list compared to the overall list, with academic learning outcomes and inclusiveness featuring in their sector list. They more frequently discussed the need for a study that links ILEs to academic learning outcomes to provide evidence for the increased investment in ILE builds. Both inclusiveness and health and wellbeing made it into their top 5, with their reasoning showing they are interested in ensuring ILEs cater for a diverse range of students. Industry was the only sector to prioritise hybrid learning environments. However, there was greater consistency between the industry responses and the overall list in terms of what they rank as their top 5. In addition to the sectors, we also explored priority areas through geographical analysis. The geographies analysis shows a high degree of consistency with the sector analysis. The 4 main priorities, affective learning outcomes, design of ILE spaces, evaluation of learning environments, and impact on student engagement are 4 of the top 5 overall priorities. Health and wellbeing, the gap that rounds out the sector analysis, was a priority for over half of the regions in the scoping study. 6 out of the 20 gaps were not cited by any region in this activity. helping us to narrow the scope of our future research. Outside of the gaps presented here, most other gaps were only cited by between 1 and 3 regions, showing that there may be some need for small localised projects in a few regions. So do we have consensus? The short answer is yes. We never expected to get the same top 5 ranking across each of the sectors and all geographical regions, but we have come close. We have multiple items that consistently rate high, and the rankings point to a need to focus on the complex overlap between student wellbeing, learning outcomes, and the evaluation of ILESE. However, it is valuable to know where there are differences between sectors. We will continue to explore this as we move forward to refine our focus. Importantly, we feel there's a logical link between these diversities. For example, there's overlap between health and wellbeing and inclusiveness gaps, and it will be the role of the roundtables to explore these links to negotiate a coherent focus for the major research project we are developing. To revisit our project overview, we are moving towards the end of stage 2. We have completed the initial ideas generation through our first round of analysis and begun to refine and rank these ideas through workshop 2 in order to help us determine areas of consensus. From the analysis presented, a clear mandate is emerging in terms of our priorities. In addition to the team workshop data, we are in the midst of collecting the second Delphi survey responses. Our analysis of Delphi Survey 1 shows good consistency with workshop 1 data, and our next step is to examine how the Delphi experts rank the 20 gaps before moving into consensus seeking with them. We are building towards the roundtables at the end of the year, where we will focus on our third research question: how should the next stage of research be designed? Prior to this, we will work through a verification process, sharing drafts of the white paper and seeking feedback to refine this document for use at the roundtables. The management team is always here to help. We look forward to discussing the findings with you and working together as we move forward towards the roundtables.
Okay. Thanks very much, Julia, for putting the video together there. Look, that was a sort of a 5-6 minute look at a lot of data. It's been a fairly complex analysis of the data, and we can bring the screen back up again to go back and look at those as we go through the conversation this afternoon. But based on the data that you've just seen and what's been found so far, we are interested in what stands out for you. What thinking does it prompt when you hear that? So we'll just open the floor up, and happy to put things in the chat if that's useful too.
Chris, can I just jump in?
Go for it.
Yep. I was going to say, interesting that evaluation is still sitting so high. You know, even though I don't necessarily think that, you know, some of the changes or some of the things that we're seeing in learning environments now are necessarily all that new anymore, or unfamiliar anymore, but there's still a lot of people are asking to sort of see that back end, and I suppose, putting on my architect hat for a minute, I think there's a real lack of that evaluative process at a sort of professional level. So I suppose it's not surprising that that's sort of reflected quite broadly in the feedback that you've had across the 3 sectors.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. Yeah, that's a really useful. Yeah, it's a good observation. Yeah.
I think you know, the way to take that a bit further, Ella, is increasingly people are working in situations where evidence of impact is required. You know, architects, educators, people in educational policy, etc. You know, and it comes down to, if you're going to spend all this money, tell us why we should be doing it. Yep. I think that sort of underpins one of the reasons why evaluation continues to be so high. Yeah.
What other thoughts do people have of seeing that overall ranking, perhaps?
Chris, I'd have to make a comment on the consistency.
Okay.
You know, it's you think it back to the workshop 1 data and similar regional Zoom there where that was presented, and now today, and the fact I must admit I wouldn't have expected the same basic things to remain high and to be consistent, not just across sectors but internationally as well. I don't know what people think about that, why that might be.
Chris, it might be just that it's 5:45 in the evening, but can you just tell me a little bit more again about what effective learning outcomes were?
That was what we referred to, sort of like 21st century learning kind of outcomes. So more of your dispositions and your competencies was how we defined that when people were given gaps. If you remember, there was kind of the 20 gaps, and we kind of had a working definition of each one. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting one, seeing how highly industry placed that. But then I also wondered whether or not, you know, ostensibly these environments are designed for 21st century learning. So, you know, in conjunction, I suppose, with the evaluation piece, you know, to what extent are they actually serving their purpose and achieving the desired outcomes?
Yeah, because that's the policy discourse around it too. If you go back to the OECD early on, that 21st century learning and how it was defined. So it is really interesting that alignment there between the three groups.
Chris, I'm just wondering, do you know off the top of your head what education rated as first? Because it's not in the top 5 ranking, and we can see what academic rated first and we can see what industry rated first, but I just wondered what education.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so first there was academic, and then student engagement, then inclusion, health and well-being, and evaluation.
It's funny the others didn't put it up there, but anyway.
That's a really good observation to make. You know, the affective learning outcomes are those things that are hard to measure. You know, engagement and enthusiasm for learning and all those lovely things. And educators, though, have put actually what scores are the kids getting. So maybe it's a reflection, Michaela, on the political times we're going through at the moment in education. I don't know. Can you think of a reason why?
Well, I'm just thinking maybe everyone's thinking, what is the purpose for being at school? You know, educators may be thinking it's all about learning, particular learning, and might be other things. Anyway, just a thought.
I think that's really interesting though, because when, as an academic, one of the things, the holy grail when you're looking through the literature is links between design and learning outcomes for children. So yeah, that's what I noticed when I saw that. It's like that from a kind of an evaluative aspect, it's really the holy grail.
And we've been beaten all the time in education about PISA results and international rankings, which is academic learning outcomes pure, you know, scores on standardized tests. Whereas, you know, perhaps the community as a whole is much more in tune with the idea of let's turn out graduates who can think laterally and who can link ideas together, and, you know, all those affective type skills. Yeah.
Can I just say that that impact on student engagement is directly linked to academic learning outcomes. And I know that we've just been having a lot of conversations in WA around a whole lot of other stuff, but certainly engaging students is one of the #1 things that we've talked about to ensure, and it's a shame health and wellbeing is a bit down on the list too, because that tends to go hand in hand with student engagement. And if those spaces everything can work together, then one would think it could lead to better learning outcomes. So, I mean, they're all linked, but certainly that student engagement factor is a big one, and just getting kids wanting to learn. And if the spaces can facilitate that, then that's the big plus.
Roz, going on from what you were just saying, I thought it was quite interesting, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but and I totally agree with what you're saying about engagement and the link to the academic learning outcomes, but that the education sector ranked, I think it was the design of ILES as sort of ninth on their priority list, which I think that speaks volumes to how or whether we're actually having an effective dialogue about how the two things are linked.
Yeah, I think there's greater opportunity for that to happen. I think sometimes, depending on the educators involved, people only know what they know, and unless there is that increased dialogue on how things can work together, then it'll probably continue to be a bit lower on the priority. But from a education design perspective, yeah, we have to work together. But yeah, interesting that it was so low.
I wonder if that the reason that was so low is, and this is just off the top of my head, really. So I'm from the New South Wales Department of Education here with Tina, I think, who's also joining us today. Yeah, here's Tina. And I wonder whether the reason that was low is simply because, not simply, but one potential reason could be that educators may not consider those design questions to be their responsibility per se, whereas they do see that, you know, the academic outcomes are definitely their responsibility, and as such, that should be their focus, their priority. And it's not that educators don't think that design should be researched, but it might just be that that's not the thing on the top of their list, because they figure that the architects are working their magic. That's just my guesstimate at that. I don't know what other educational representatives here on the call think.
Just a thought around the design of learning environments as well. I guess there's that kind of concept, you know, the initiation of design, but then there's also the design of the space within the space as well. So there's kind of like the building design, and then there's the interior space and how everything's arranged internally. So I think there's kind of like two phases as well. One is that, you know, during the building, but then the other is in everyday use. I'm not sure if anyone's got any kind of, you know, thoughts around that. So maybe they were thinking about the build and the fact that they only think about the build design during construction as opposed to internal setup.
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in here. Just you talked about, like, from an educator perspective, Chris from Singapore. When I think about, like, the idea when like research into the design of spaces, I think I look at it through the lens of, like, to what end, right? And so to me, that end is reflected more by, like, what I see in that education ranking. Like, we're looking at the design of spaces to the end of improving academic learning outcomes or student engagement, inclusivity. So yeah. I don't see them as separate. I see them as combined, but one kind of informing the others.
And I think Julie will be better at answering this than me, or making comment on it. But there is what you might call some sort of correlation between a number of the variables or a number of the items. You know, where one actually is embedded in the other to some degree. Julie, that's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was quite tricky for us to go through all the workshop one findings and actually sort of find these 20 discrete gaps, given that there are so many overlaps, and that makes it quite complex. And I think that's now where this ranking is starting to help, because, as we said, things like, you know, inclusiveness and health and wellbeing are sort of sitting there on the educators list, and yet there are lots of overlaps in the way people talk about it. When we asked you to sort of give the reasonings for why you put things into the top 5, often people were putting things in the top 5 that they saw as being all part of that same puzzle as you're describing, Chris, that they're not really discrete, that when things are actually in use in the classroom and we're changing things, they do have a lot of overlap. So that's our challenge now, is sort of how do we find factors that we can measure and probably target that evaluation component that's missing to get really good data out there, but not try and simplify a process that we know is actually very complex.
Yeah, it just one thing when we were seeing the list that I was curious to know about. Like, I know like our group for the workshop 2 was pretty educator heavy. And so it made me wonder, like, to what degree might the makeup of those different groups have played in just like the conversation, and then where the rankings landed, right? If you had a group that was predominantly educators, would that ranking had turned out, was that discreetly or significantly different than if you had more of a mixed group having that conversation? Just something I was wondering as I was looking at those lists.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. It's very purposefully why we made you do it individually and at the start of the workshop, was in the hopes that, we could get people's individual thoughts. But of course, even the ongoing discussions that we have over time are certainly going to shape what goes onto those lists. So it's, it's never going to be 100% perfect or accurate, whatever accurate is.
And I think, Chris, the makeup of some of our groups are very educator heavy, some are very industry heavy, some are quite academic heavy, and then there's some that sort of have more of a broad range. So overall, it's and we have tried. When we've done the analysis, we've looked at where those. That was the reason really for going back in and looking at where the specific ratings or the specific weighting was for the individual sectors. Yeah.
Just picking up. Sorry, don't mean to interrupt. Just picking up on the conversation around, it's been going for a little while, starting with those conversations around design and how that's carried through. And I'm listening to what Chris is saying about the educator-heavy section of Group 2. It's interesting that even though we had that, we still came out with an aspect where design didn't feature well for educators. And I'm wondering whether that's because as an educator, you are very much student focused, and the environment that you're in is something that you adapt to, and you don't perceive that you have a significant role in shaping. Where you tend to shape the experience, and that might be why the experience and the learning outcomes featured much higher. As an educator, you have a much greater role in shaping the experience for the child using the resources you have for you, rather than designing the resources that you have for you to then bring about change or bring about outcomes for your students. That's just a perspective I'm listening to and hearing. I'm wondering whether that's something that's valid in this situation.
I think that's a really good point to make, Russell. I think one thing we need to remind ourselves with this whole conversation, though, is these 5 here are actually the top 5 of 20. So it's not like, number 1 academic learning outcomes hugely outrates number 5 evaluation learning environments on this scale just here. The reality is they're all so close. I think, and again, Julia or Chris will be better at answering this, but the actual number, the percentage of rankings was actually very similar across the top 5. There wasn't really a lot in it. That's right, Julia?
Yeah, that's right. So we remembering that we didn't actually ask you to rank and say we need number 1 through number 5. We asked you to cluster them into the top 5. So when you see what sort of lands, and we're just counting everything as sort of that equal 1. If it went into that top 5 bucket, it got a point. There wasn't a huge amount of difference across the top 5s. And then the interesting thing is that there was, obviously what was bottom 5 was also quite clearly distinguishable. And then there's a lot in the middle that sort of varies depending on the sector too.
Julia, can you talk a little bit about what the sort of bottom 5 were, that if there was that sort of same consistency across the sectors?
Oh, yeah. I would love to get that up right now, but I can say that basically the bottom one, Ella, is COVID. Everyone seemed to just be a little bit sick. And this is combining sort of the qualitative comments in terms of the reasons that people gave. Everyone's a bit sick of COVID, I think, and didn't want to see sort of a specific study around it. Things like subject-specific research and having that discipline focus wasn't there. People were much more interested in these bigger ideas that cross sort of, you know, whole student cohorts and groups. Other things like technology generally rates quite low. And I think they're probably the main three that are coming to the top of my head immediately. But I would say that the general consensus that things were that people are sort of seeing as either, I think probably in technologies it was, you know, that they're fairly ubiquitous now, and it's going to again be part of, if we're looking at design, then technology is probably going to be part of that, rather than being a discrete topic for research on its own. That tended to be sort of that. Sorry, there's my dog. The overlapping, you know, if it was more specific, then it was tended to be in the bottom 5, and otherwise, these bigger picture ideas were in the top 5.
I have a question about the report, I guess the workshop 1 report, and the presentation in relation to those findings in the report. Not having the report in front of me, sort of like very present and memorized. Do you sorry about that. Is the information that we're sharing here today, do you feel like it's an update on what was communicated in that report, a confirmation, or a slight, I guess, further detail of, or, you know, how does this sit in relation to the report?
Julia's had to go to quieten the dog. I'll start it off, Julia, just by simply saying there's different type of data here. This is actually data on rankings. The first report was data just on citations or frequencies. So an example would be in the first workshop, people might have mentioned design as being a higher, you know, that came up many, many times. So I've got a higher ranking or a high number, but they might have been talking about it in a negative way rather than a positive way. It didn't matter. It was still just the number of times it was mentioned. Whereas in this study, we've taken all those items and asked people to rank them in terms of importance. So this ranking is a different measure. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so surprised at how consistent we've been, that even though we're dealing with different data sets, we're actually still getting some quite consistent results. Sorry, Julie, I thought you were off rescuing the dog, so I jumped in.
I was more rescuing my neighbours from his barking. But yes, no, that's accurate. Whereas that, you know, everything that came in that workshop 1 report was based on really open-ended questions, and so it is a different type of analysis, even though it's the same research gaps were generated. But I agree with Wes. I think really the key difference between workshop 1 was that there was much more emphasis on teaching in the discussions that came up, and that focus has slightly shifted here, but overall it is fairly consistent despite there being 2 different ways of asking the questions, and this one being much more about ranking.
Thanks.
The other thing that we're always mindful when we're doing the analysis of this data is that there is a lot of bleeding or a lot of correlation between the criteria, between the items. You know, example would be COVID. You know, overwhelmingly is the lowest score across the board on sectors, geographies, across first workshop, across second. But don't forget that embedded in COVID is things like hybrid learning and student engagement, you know, school systems, all those sorts of other things which were probably rated in the other items that came in. So, you know, we're always mindful as we look at the data we're presenting at the moment, it still is just a picture according to the parameters we put around how we actually analyse the data. And again, that's one of the reasons why this workshop and this data set that Julie and Chris are presenting is so interesting, is because the consistency, even though it's, you know, using different set of parameters, it's still coming up with the same items, which we honestly didn't expect. We expected it actually to be quite diverse. So yeah, it's fascinating.
I might just sort of, if we just move on a little bit with the conversation, and I think it's really interesting to pick up on people's responses and you know, kind of see how that jars or how it sort of is sort of faithful to people's perspectives, really. what we've established, I guess, as Julia talked about, was that yes, there is a large degree of consensus. We've got multiple items that consistently rate highly, and that point towards that need to focus very much on that sort of overlap between sort of student wellbeing, learning outcomes, and the evaluation of ILEs. What we're interested in as well is where do you see this as leading, or what are the implications for your own sector? We've got people in policy and in academia, in industry, in education, but what benefits do you see? How we might utilize this information, or utilize this in terms of leveraging into a further project? Where do you see it as being valuable in your sector?
I think in our area, I'm just thinking of, I was a wee bit surprised, and this may not be a nice reflection on myself, but I was a little bit surprised how high health and wellbeing popped up. And when we do our education briefs with new builds and refurbishments and whatnot, I don't think we really focus heavily on health, definitely wellbeing, but we do talk about inclusivity, we talk about access to schools and so on. But health is a separate thing. I don't know. Kerry might jump in, because Kerry's a navigator and she's on here. But I was surprised to see that pop up anyway.
I wonder if that's a sort of a COVID related, certainly the discourse around wellbeing has increased, was on the increase anyway before COVID, but certainly has possibly been embedded during COVID.
That's true, because we do have responses, like for example, when we had the mosque attacks in Christchurch, and students were locked down in their classrooms for hours, and we realised that not all students could access a toilet from their classroom and had to use rubber bins. So from that point, we've designed buildings so that students could always access a toilet if they're in a lockdown situation. So I think when there's something big happens, you do respond to it in your design going forward.
Yeah, we all went out and bought buckets after that, Michaela.
Sorry?
We had to go out and buy buckets.
Buckets with lids.
Lids, yes.
And I think, Michaela, I agree totally with what you've just said. It wasn't something when we first were navigating with schools that we thought to discuss. And then as these iterations and things happened, it started to become more part of the conversation.
Interesting working with student teachers. They often devise projects in our context to respond to features of ILEs in terms of promoting student wellbeing, in terms of navigating acoustics and large numbers and individual, learning needs and preferences. So that one has, I was quite surprised. I saw it pop up probably about 2 or 3 years ago as something important that I kind of dismissed, but each year it's got bigger and bigger in terms of the response to probably the design features or the lived experience of ILEs by student teachers.
Thanks, Emily, and I think there's close links with engagement as well. Actually having learners who are ready to actually engage in learning to start with. There's some real bottom lines around health and well-being, which I know in the New Zealand context have sort of are a bit exacerbated through some of the equity conversations that we're having as well. And we're seeing considerable challenges, so probably mental health as much as physical health, and the impact that that's having on actually engaging with the school system at all, let alone with learning.
And I think
I'd
that's the
agree.
way the coding happened with this notion of health, because it wasn't health as in, you know, children being well. It was a health in terms of physical health, mental health, emotional health. That really broad range of issues that does marry together with well-being. That was the way, Chris, you know, when you, Julie, and I did all the coding, that was the way that we interpreted this. We put student off that, and it was student health and well-being, but even then it doesn't really explain it fully. Yeah.
Maybe Wes, it's you know, the link, thinking about you know, that health and well-being as linked to a sense of belonging, and I guess children who moving from a single-celled classroom with one teacher, you know, to maybe potentially 2, 3, 4 teachers in a, you know, big space. That idea of like, you know, identity and well-being and belonging as well.
I think it's also about students with special needs. Most of our schools have got a higher proportion of kids on the autistic spectrum. And in those ILES, we had quite a discussion about it in our group around how we accommodate that in those open spaces and being able to make them adaptable so that those kids who need to self-regulate or to be able to move into a safe space so that they can continue their learning. It's something that is of consideration. But that being on show all the time, there's that side of it, dealing with kids in that regard. So another thing that links with well-being is how to accommodate for the different learning styles and the different mental health issues that our students have. It's interesting also, someone was talking recently about the health and well-being of staff in these areas too. And I guess that's something also to think about. There's not too many private spaces for teachers. It was just an interesting comment. So just something to think about, I guess.
I think so many teachers have found that a challenge, Ros, you know, moving from what has traditionally been quite an autonomous and private kind of landscape of practice into something that's much more inherently visible and observable or seeable. So yeah, I think there's certainly an element of that. I also, coming back to your previous thought about the thinking about how we adapt spaces for students and provide, you know, multiple opportunities and things like, you know, for students who need to withdraw or de-escalate or whatever. I think that those discussions have been prompted in part by the shift into innovative learning environments. And, you know, to some extent, we weren't actually having those conversations beforehand, because when you're in a traditional classroom, there isn't anywhere else to go. It's, you're in it or you're out of it. Whereas to some extent, we're having conversations now, but we're actually designing particular affordances in spaces in order to specifically accommodate these different, the different opportunities or challenges. Are there any other, any other thoughts of, any other thoughts that come to people this evening? And then I want to finish off this evening with a bit of an overview of what's coming next. So any other thoughts before we move on from this bit?
I've been looking at that list, wondering about it from a student perspective, you know, because the student experience part, it will be interesting on each of those measures to see what the kids think.
Excellent. I think, Emily, that would be most appropriate.
Sign me up.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly a priority for any broader study that stems from this, really, as to how do you authentically and, you know, gain the participation of learners to be part of something like this. Obviously, it was outside the scope of this particular project, but yeah, you're dead on.
Yeah, I mean, the whole name is student experience. You know, we've done so much good work over the years designing really good spaces and of learning how to teach in them and learning how to engage kids in them. You know, there's still a lot more work to do for sure, but the notion of the reality of kids actually, how they actually inhabit these spaces is totally unknown to us. You know, and you watch any two students in the space and you'll question, why is that student do that while that one's doing that? And it's because there are personal motivations, needs, etc., abilities, all sorts of reasons why they're doing that. And, you know, I've been talking a while now, the presentations I've been doing about that, this is actually the new area we have to move into. You know, we now need to treat really good design of these spaces as just being the baseline, that architects have got so good at designing these fantastic spaces and governments are supporting them. You know, that's just the status quo now. And now we've got to understand, well, what's it like for kids to actually live and inhabit these spaces, not just occupy them, but actually inhabit them. So that is the reason why the SE is there. It was impossible for us to include student voice in this, but it has to be part of how we move forward. It was impossible because we simply wouldn't have got ethics and wouldn't have been able to run the project in the time we had. But there's no way that we can do the study now without the heavy involvement of students within whatever comes from this. Yeah.
Thanks, Wes. So as a bit of an overview of where we are up to, this is obviously a roundup of the second workshop. In parallel to this, you'll know we have the Delphi project, the Delphi study going on at the same time. In fact, I might even just share a different one. Let's have a look. I think. Oh yeah, let's share that one. I think. Is that showing? Yeah. So we're now sort of, if you can see the line here, we're now at sort of the regional zone 2, and with the Delphi survey having just about rounding off the second phase of that, and heading towards the third workshop and then into the round table as well in November, which comes in that middle week of November. So Wes, do you want to just talk a little bit about where we're heading next?
Yeah, I can, or Julie can. But I love that. Give better presentations. Chris, did you see that come up?
Sorry?
Sorry, the thing popped up on your screen. We are in the regional zones serve the purpose of just getting informal feedback and thinking around what we're finding and what we're presenting back to you. The Delphi surveys are being run as a totally separate project, but using the data that you people are giving us through the workshops in terms of how to structure and what to ask. So effectively, they are mirroring what we're doing, just they're a bit behind. And it will be fascinating to see how a different population of people nominated as experts by us, how they either, mirror what we're finding and thinking or coming up with different things. All of that stuff will come together at the round table. So we're working towards that. The blue bars at the top are important because that's actually what your management team is doing. And we're continuing the bottom bar there to do analysis. While we're doing that, we're in the process of starting to write up the draft of the white paper, which is obviously the major report, if you like, from this project. And from that, we're developing up this concept of, what is all of this telling us about what research has to be done next. And I have to be honest in saying, the type of data we're collecting and the way it's coming together is giving us a little bit of a head run on that final big project, because it's becoming quite clear to us anyway as a research team what that final thing might look like. So we're in the process of developing that through the white paper. We're going to come up with a bit of an idea of that white paper in terms of workshop 3, which we'll want to run early in November. And workshop 3 will be the last event the teams come together from to actually talk about as a whole group, to talk about the research. Workshop 3 is not going to be data collection, it's going to be validation. Do people agree with the thinking we put into the first layer of the white paper? are we on the right track from everything we've experienced together over the last year? That gives us a bit of time then to polish up the white paper and take it to the roundtables where, as you know, a representative from each team is funded to come and sit down in 2 areas, one in Melbourne and one in Copenhagen, and to go over that white paper and pull it apart and to think clearly about how does research come out of this. And then the final thing we'll do as a group and wrap up will be the regional Zoom 3, an event like this that will be in February, where we say, well, this is what we found, this is what we're doing, and this is how we're moving ahead. That's the sort of the scope, Chris, that we're doing. And I suppose the previous slide helps to illustrate some of the feedback we're trying to put into place in terms of the workshop groups and the teams of, this is what we're finding, this is how we present it. So that other diagram Chris had is actually, this one here is a list of the publications that we're working on to help to feed information back, leading obviously to the roundtable and then to the white paper. Julia, is that accurate, or did I leave something out?
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. I think it's just really important to know that there is a time for the teams to come back together to talk, particularly because there'll be a minimum one person from your team hopefully at the roundtables, and possibly more. But I know a few team leaders were thinking about how they best get that perspective of their team to the roundtables, and just to know that there is a mechanism for you to talk about the white paper and then come to the roundtable having had a bit of a pre-discussion. Yeah, fine.
Yeah, that definitely answers one of the questions that we've had, which was, when does that thinking happen? So thanks, both of you. Just on that note, just a reminder that if in your team, hopefully having discussions about organising who's able to come over for the regional roundtable and who's going to be able to represent your team there. If you haven't done so yet, please get in touch with Kelly and let her know, and she's helping to sort out the travel arrangements and the accommodation and things like that. Liliana, I can see you hand up.
Look, it was just a suggestion or a comment, however you'd like to see it, about maybe the way, I'm actually going back to the data you were presenting, maybe something that, at least for me, and I don't know about others, makes it a little easier to grasp really what these rankings mean is if it's possible to phrase them maybe as research questions, even if they're not the actual research question that will come of these topics, let's say of these 20 topic areas. Sometimes that just, I think it helps make it a little bit more concrete. And I know that the report, and I found the report, so I've got it in front of me, it was more specific about what exactly each of those topics really included, examples of what was actually raised. It's just a thought, if that's something that you can include in your, maybe that minor report you had listed for October, or in the final report if more appropriate. I do know it could be a double-edged sword, and people might hang on too tightly to the research questions, even if they're just suggested. Then it's hard to undo that thinking. But I'll just put it out there as something that might be an alternative way to present that information. Just a thought, that's all.
No, thanks, Leanne. That's a really good observation.
And I think in some ways we addressed that a little bit in the last workshop, where we said, I don't know if you remember the question about the claims. What claim would you like to see made from research that comes out of this? So it's a backwards way of asking for the research question, in effect. So your point's exactly right, that the topics like health and wellbeing, perhaps we are getting mature enough in our analysis of this data to actually go further and state it as a research question or topic, or a very focused research, focus. Yeah. So we'll take that on board. Thanks, Liliana.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I was thinking that is I was recalling, I think it was the first workshop when we had, I think, a larger number of people who were able to attend that one. And I do remember coming away and thinking some of the things that were raised as kind of interests or needs by some of the participants, they weren't necessarily thought of as research questions. They were just sort of like, this is a hot topic. I keep getting asked about this. I'm just going to put it out there as something that's of importance. Whether or not it could actually be shaped into a research question was kind of that next step. And I just remember thinking, oh, there's a bit of a, yeah, there is a next step here, and it might help to make it more concrete for those representatives who may not necessarily have their research hat on and thinking in research question terms. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and we'll certainly come. The roundtables will be focused largely on that. But your point is, let's make sure we cover it with teams first. Yeah, yeah, it's good. Chris, sorry. I was just going to say before you finish off, whether you might like to ask Kelly to give, if she's got any comments about the organisation going forward.
Hi, everyone. Probably a lot of you are starting to get emails from me into your inboxes regarding organising the roundtables. I've heard back from quite a few teams now about who you're sending when you'd like to travel. Still a few teams where there's gaps. I know it takes a while to sort of work out exactly how that's all going. But just feel free to get in touch at any point if you've got any questions about what that looks like. I've heard from, a lot of our teams, but there's a few missing. So if you're not sure about anything, please just get in touch.
Good. Thanks, Kelly.
When is the Learn program coming out?
Hopefully this week is the we've said that a couple of weeks. We have said that for a couple of weeks. There's just been a few loose ends we've been trying to get right before we sort of put it out there. We sort of don't want to put out half a program or an Eventbrite registration with gaps, because that will just sort of generate more questions. So we'd like to sort of send it out, with all those gaps filled in.
And we'll try to target the websites, the Learn website, the ILETC website, the ILESE website, the Building Connections website. The LEA will approach them and ask them to circulate. So hopefully that plus our one here, people will get that flyer when it comes out with the links to Eventbrite. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming along this evening. Thanks for your engagement and questions. I think you've certainly left us with some things to take away and to think about in terms of next steps as well. So we really appreciate your input. And we are recording this one, so there will be a recording of it available should you want to come back to it. But unless there are any other thoughts, Wes or Julia or anybody, I'll say thanks very much indeed for coming along, and look forward to seeing you at the next workshops, and then ultimately many of you at the round table as well.
Thank you, Chris.
Kia ora.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you.